I've been making spaghetti sauce with tomatoes and Italian sausage for over 30 years, and this version with homemade Italian sausage is by far the tastiest I have ever made. You may be tempted to use store-bought Italian sausage. Don't. You may be tempted to buy your pork pre-ground. Don't. You may be tempted to use pre-ground black pepper, and sure, you could use these shortcuts if you've never made a sauce like this before and need to start someplace easier, but the homemade Italian sausage really makes this sauce. It requires some extra time and effort, but it's well worth it, trust me. We're going to start by making Italian sausage from scratch. If you are more of a beginning level cook, you can skip this step and buy 1 to 2 pounds of pre-made Italian sausage instead. It's okay, I'll forgive you. And if you want to skip the sausage making altogether and get right to the sauce, I've put in a time code for you. But if you are up for an adventure and want a richer sauce with more intense flavor, I highly recommend that you make your own Italian sausage. You don't need a meat grinder or any other fancy equipment. All you need is a food processor, a freezer, and some spices. I'm starting with a pork shoulder roast. Usually they come in 3 to 4 pound chunks, sometimes with a bone, sometimes without. So I usually buy a 4-pound roast and cut roughly half of it off for this recipe. I just eyeball it. The other half of the roast I'll turn into carnitas or cut it into pieces for stir fries and whatnot. And if I have no immediate plans for the other half of the roast, I freeze it for later. The half of the roast that has the most fat is the part that you're going to want to use for the sausage. Don't be scared of the fat here. Fat is flavor. And this is partly why we're grinding our own pork shoulder instead of using pre-ground pork. Now, for one thing, pre-ground pork is more expensive and harder to come by than pork shoulder roast. And for another, pre-ground pork is usually quite lean and therefore dry and lacking in flavor. So it really is worth it to grind your own pork. First, if there's skin on your roast, you will need to remove that. I'm cutting my pork skin into strips here, which I'm going to render slowly and turn into treats for my cat. After the skin is removed and dealt with, or if there's no skin on your roast to begin with, cut the rest of the meat into 1-inch cubes. Now, I cut mine too big here, and I'm going to pay the price for it later, so do as I say and not as I do, and cut it into 1-inch cubes. Then you want to place those 1-inch cubes of pork onto a cookie sheet and make sure it fits in your freezer and there's room for it in advance. Hopefully you'll be able to fit all the pieces of pork onto one sheet. If not, you can always do it in batches. Anyway, you'll want to freeze the pork for 30 to 60 minutes or until it's starting to freeze but isn't frozen. The reason why is that it's much easier to grind meat properly in a food processor if it's slightly frozen. And that's just what we're going to do now. Fill your food processor no higher than 1/2 of the way up with some pork cubes and pulse several times. It'll look like you're making no progress at the start, and if you're like me, it's because you cut your cubes too big and you need to cut them all in half with a knife. But regardless, it may take several pulses before your meat starts to grind. Keep pulsing until eventually your pork looks like this. Now keep in mind, we're going to stew this pork low and slow for about 3 hours, so it's actually okay if some chunks are bigger than others and the grind is inconsistent. Dump what you've ground into a big bowl and repeat the process 2 to 3 more times until you have the rest of your pork cubes ground. Once all of your pork is ground, it's time to grind one of the most important components of this sauce, black pepper. Now, you may be tempted to use pre-ground, but I implore you to grind your own, especially if you've gone through the trouble of grinding your own pork. The freshly ground black pepper adds a huge depth of flavor to this sauce that you can really taste, and I promise it's worth it. Add the 2 teaspoons of black pepper to the ground pork, and while you have your spice grinder out, grind 1 teaspoon of fennel seed and add that to the pork as well. And just a note that if you don't have a spice grinder or a coffee grinder, which is technically what I'm using here, you can use a mortar and pestle or crush your spices with a heavy pan or a brick or something. Now that we've finished grinding, let's add the rest of the sausage seasonings. That would be 2 tablespoons of red wine vinegar, 2 teaspoons each of salt, dried parsley, garlic powder, and onion powder, 1/2 teaspoon of brown sugar, 1 tablespoon Italian seasoning, 1 teaspoon of paprika, and 1 to 2 teaspoons of red pepper flakes. Then you want to get in there with your impeccably clean fingers and knead the mixture by hand until all the seasonings are thoroughly incorporated. It'll be very cold, so I recommend having a bowl of warm water in the sink that you can stick your hands in every once in a while. Now, there is a slight flaw in this recipe, and that we've just made 2 pounds of Italian sausage, but the sauce only requires 1.5 pounds. You can, of course, make a 3/4 recipe of the sausage or do a 1 1/3 recipe of the sauce to remedy this, but what I like to do is separate out 1/4 of this sausage for other uses. It is so yummy that I don't mind having a little extra. Usually I'll put it on pizza, but you could also fry it up as a couple patties for breakfast. That would be delightful. Now let's make the sauce. In a Dutch oven over medium-high heat, lightly brushed with oil, add the Italian sausage and sauté until it's browned a little and cooked through. Then lower the heat to medium or medium-low, add a minced medium-sized yellow onion, and sauté until the onion is translucent. Now this should take about 5 minutes, and you can cover with a lid to help speed up the process. Just make sure the onion doesn't brown or burn. Then add 4 to 6 cloves of minced garlic and sauté until fragrant. This should only take about a minute. At this point, I'll also add a teaspoon of Italian seasoning. Then add a 30-ounce can of crushed tomatoes and half a cup of red wine and let the sauce simmer uncovered for at least 1 minute. Now, the red wine is another very important ingredient in my book. It's what separates my spaghetti sauce from most other homemade or store-bought sauces I've had. Without the wine, the sauce tastes overly bright and tin canny. Anyway, it adds a lot of depth and smooths over any harsher flavors, so I strongly advise you to not skip on the red wine. Top off your sauce with about half a cup of water, which is enough to clean the tomato can and appease the Italian grandmas. Cover with a lid and simmer gently for 2 hours. This is a great opportunity to take a nap. After your 2-hour nap, remove the lid and let it simmer uncovered for 1 hour or until the sauce has reduced and thickened to a good consistency. Add water if it gets too thick. This will all come down to personal preference, but it's better to err on the side of thicker since you're going to add pasta water to it later when you prepare your pasta. Speaking of which, cook some spaghetti until it's 1 to 2 minutes underdone, reserving 1/4 cup of pasta water per serving. Drain the spaghetti, then add it back to the pot with about 1/2 to 3/4 of a cup of sauce per serving and 1/4 cup of pasta water per serving. Stir and cook for 2 minutes until the sauce is soaked in and the spaghetti is just cooked and not watery. Then serve with freshly grated Parmesan or nutritional yeast if you have a bunch left over from a vegan video you made 2 years ago, and your spaghetti with homemade Italian sausage sauce is ready to eat. The whole recipe makes about 6 to 8 servings of sauce, so it's great to make over a weekend and eat leftover throughout the week. It also freezes well if you can't eat it all quickly enough, but we rarely have that problem. Thanks for watching, and I hope you give this sauce a try soon. Thank you to all my patrons for helping me buy the ingredients for these videos, with a special thanks to Chrissy, Britt, Honey Badgers, Megan M, Matthew, Jenny D, Robert Z, Mercedes, Jocelyn, Manila, Gina F, Megan B, Data Fox, Stacy, Gina S, Ruth, Katie, Lonesome Screams, Mihir, Veda, Morgan, Vifafo, Britta, Slawek, and Colette. Wow, I did that all in one breath. Bye.